All right. Good afternoon, fellow Geeks Under Grace. Joining me today is Angela Chalupa, a journalist
Oh,
and writer.
Andrea.
Andrea.
No, no worries. I like the name Angela, though. It's a beautiful name. But
Honestly,
yes.
I thought I was going to mess up the last name. I'm glad All right. Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and writer who contributed to websites including the Huffington Post, the author of Orwell and the Refugees, co-host of the Gaslit Nation podcast, and the screenwriter of 2020's most underrated film, Mr. Jones, which we reviewed last month. How's your day going?
It's great. It's interesting. It's just a weird year, right? It's 2020. We're all just trying to make it through. So I'm just trying to make it through. Yeah.
Well, tolerance is the best way to describe it. You tolerate 2020, and
Yes.
the important thing is
Yes.
to wake up at the other end of it.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. We just we all are a success if we can make it through this year.
Sure. So tell our audience if anything about yourself that I didn't cover in my intro. There is there what else is there about that you've done career wise?
Well, I guess you know what? It's like you're like my Ukrainian immigrant mother. It's like, it's like what have
I'm
you done with
sorry.
your life? Isn't it enough that I wrote and produced this film? Isn't that enough?
Well, it's an impressive list. I didn't know if I missed anything.
No, that's it. That's the list. But yeah, yeah. No, I guess 2020 for me, with everything going on, is also processing the fact that Mr. Jones, this film that I've dedicated well over a decade to, is finally out. It's finally out in the world, and it's been a really long process just accepting that and,
Wow.
and realizing what that means. Because I don't know how to explain it, because I was attracted to talking to you because your review was so thoughtful, Tyler. Like, your
Aw.
review was really thoughtful, really sensitive, and I think to make a film like this, it's extremely challenging. People aren't throwing money at you to make a genocide film. Like, no one wants to make a genocide film, really. And so it was a very, very tough tough journey just to get to this point. And I was so busy in the journey that I almost wasn't really prepared for the audience reaction. And for a while, I had my husband read the reviews so I wouldn't have to. And I finally adjusted and got used to the film being out there, and I would read the reviews directly myself because I felt safe enough to. And I read yours, and I was just so touched by it. So it's an honor to talk to you.
Aw. Well, it's not every day that someone who directs a film you admire retweets you on Twitter. So it was an honor for me too.
Oh, I'm so yeah. That's nice that we connected. Yeah. So but so yeah. So I didn't direct it.
Well, yeah, I know. Well, sorry, I misspoke, but
Not Angela.
no, 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 no. But
We
I
were talking about a different Mr. Jones film. No, you know,
Well, the funny
it's a
thing is, every
great.
time I go online to like look it up, there's like three other movies called Mr. Jones. So I'm like,
Right,
oh, the
right,
one I'm looking for, and there's like some horror movie from 2010 and some like movie
right,
from like the 80s. So I was like, oh, again, I look at the right one, right? But yeah. So you said you've been working on this for a decade. How
a
did that
trillion
kind of
years. Yes.
how did that begin?
Well, I would say the whole journey of Mr. Jones really started. The whole seed was planted when I watched Schindler's List as a little girl. I remember watching that. I think I was like 11 years old, and I was with my mother took me to go see it with a friend, and my friend was turning away because she was so horrified by what was on the screen, but I couldn't turn away. I kept staring at I kept staring at Schindler's List. I was so deeply moved and shaken and inspired by the power of cinema and how so much that I didn't know existed happened. I was educated in that I was transformed in the experience of watching Schindler's List. And I just got such a compelling sense of cinema as justice. That was instilled in me in that moment, and I mean that sincerely, because what I did a lot as a kid was a lot of what I do now as an adult for a career. I would write plays, I would produce shows. I produced a talk show there's a video of me talking to my friend about politics, and that's what I do for a living today. I have a podcast, Gaslit Nation, that you mentioned, where I just talk to a friend about politics. I would write these really dramatic stories, these plays, and I would produce them in my living room and cast them, and that's what I ended up doing. And I knew that I wanted to be a filmmaker. Even as a little girl, I dressed up as a Hollywood producer for Halloween one year. And I didn't want to just make movies. It's easy to make a horror movie. It's easy to make a rom-com, relatively easy, I should say. And you can write those scripts and you can get somebody to option them, and maybe they'll get made, maybe they won't. But it's much harder to make a film that you really want to have some sort of impact on the world and to bring some sort of justice. And that's what I was very focused and committed on doing. And that was that was a journey that I took extremely seriously at a young age, a calling, really. And so when I got into university, I studied Soviet history. I was inspired to do that because my family, both my mother and father's families, they escaped the hell of Stalin. They escaped Ukraine during the hell on earth opening up across Central Europe and Eastern Europe, known as the Bloodlands. They survived both the Nazis and the Soviets, and my parents immigrated to America with nothing. They achieved the American dream working hard. And I wanted to pass on all the opportunities they afforded me through their sacrifice and hard work by doing something meaningful and paying tribute to our family history, specifically my grandfather who was the absolute world to me growing up. And when my parents were off busy with their careers, my grandfather would babysit me and take me to the park and to get donuts, and I would sing Little Mermaid at the top of my lungs, and I had like the best time with him. He was my best friend. And so when he passed away, that left such a big impact on me. And I started researching Soviet history in college. And in doing so, I stumbled on the horrific story of Walter Duranty. I want to make clear that I knew who Walter Duranty was, even as a little girl. Walter Duranty was the New York Times Moscow bureau chief, who was the king of Moscow. He lived this fabulous life of luxury and drugs and women and celebrity, all while helping the Soviets deliberately cover up Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine that deliberately mass murdered millions, the vast majority of victims in Ukraine. And it was my grandfather who survived this famine. And I knew that my best friend, my buddy, my grandfather, lived through this. And shortly before my grandfather passed away, he wrote down his entire life story about he typed his memoir in Ukrainian, not using a Ukrainian typewriter, and his stories about the famine, being barely surviving the famine with his family, being arrested as a young man during Stalin's purges, and all of it. And he left me his memoir right before he passed away. And so I had that gift with me. And after I graduated university, I saved up some money, and I moved to Ukraine for 5 months, and I started researching the screenplay for Mr. Jones while living in Ukraine in 2005.
Wow, so that's a long process, a long development process then.
Yes. Yeah.
So what was the road to getting it actually financed and made then?
Well, that was, I think it took a while just to really immerse myself in the research. I spent a lot of time hanging out in the research and trying to read as many primary sources as possible. I think that is such a huge benefit, where you read the journalists and writers and artists of the age to get into the mentality of the age, because so much of history that we learn in school can be a bit sanitized. But if you're reading primary sources as the events unfold, 1933, early 1933, we have the rise of Hitler and Stalin getting away with killing millions. And if you slow down that period and read people in their own words, it's so much more compelling in absorbing history. So I spent a long time doing that. And I went through several versions of the screenplay. I learned how to write a screenplay, which took a very long time, especially because my day job, I was a journalist, and journalists do not like poetic license. The good ones don't. And so I had a very tough time in going from being a journalist to a screenwriter, because it was painful to do poetic license. So just the script process itself took an extraordinarily long time. And it wasn't until 2015 when I was nearly ready to sort of give up on the project, because it wasn't going anywhere, and I was really embarrassed, and everybody was asking about it, and nothing was happening. But they're asking me about it in a very almost like, oh, you're still working on that? And so I was having a dark night of the soul, and I was ready to walk. I just didn't know what to do anymore. I felt it was like me against the world, and what ended up happening was a group of friends, a group of Russian friends in New York City, invited me to participate in a march in New York City, in solidarity with Boris Nemtsov's march in Moscow. Boris Nemtsov was a charismatic Russian opposition leader, and he was organizing a nationwide march in Russia against Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And so I was getting ready to join my friends at this march, and a few days before it was going to happen, Boris Nemtsov was murdered in the shadow of the Kremlin. And I saw like the look of fear in my Russian friend's eyes, and I was just so angry about what happened, because Boris Nemtsov was the hope of Russia. He was just this wonderful beacon of truth and unity between Russia and Ukraine. And he was like the anti-Putin, and he showed an alternative to life in Russia besides Putin. And just to have him taken from us like that was just heartbreaking. And I just saw the heartbreak and the hopelessness in my Russian friends, and I felt such urgency to fight back at that moment. And so I redoubled my efforts, and I wrote a very angry draft of Mr. Jones that grabbed the reader by the throat and basically said, how dare you not care about what's happening in the world right now? And that was the draft that I sent to Agnieszka Holland. It was like my Hail Mary pass. I had no idea whether she would read it, whether she would respond to my email. I happened to get her email through a mutual friend who's a historian, the historian Tim Snyder. And I just went for it, and she read it and signed on right away. And she had that same sense of urgency that I did, and the two of us united, and everybody rallied in a matter of weeks. People just showed up for us, and we had about 3 years of shopping the project around to financiers across Europe and North America, and just trying to find the right fit among the team. And people who got the project really, really got it. And those that didn't just fell away, didn't go the distance with us. And I think what's so essential that I learned in filmmaking is that every single person, from the director to the producers to the financiers to the actors, every single person involved in that film has to be making the same movie. There's no compromise in that. Like, we all saw the same film, and that's the film we made. And that's so essential, because you have to move mountains together. And if you do not all see the same film, then you're working against each other, and that mountain's not moving. And so I was very blessed that a coalition of soulmates came together around this project, and we all saw the same film, and we all fought for it. And now it's out in the world.
That's interesting. I was speculating in the piece as to what the film specifically I thought was trying to address, because I kind of I had a couple of ideas of what it could have been specifically kind of poking at in terms of stuff going on right now, but it's interesting to hear that specifically comes from your feeling of trying to reveal this kind of lost history. I didn't know if that necessarily translated to everyone involved's desire for the project. I mean, my read on it was kind of that it was partially a Polish polemic, but knowing that the screenwriter is American changes the read on it a little bit. Do you know what Miss Holland's intent was behind it, or what she was most attracted to?
Yeah, I know that with Agnieszka, I think your read on it is correct, in the sense that obviously Poland suffered greatly under Stalin. And, if you look at the Katyn massacre, and how the Soviet army waited on the banks of a river while the Warsaw Uprising got slaughtered by the Nazis. It's sort of. So I think your take on it is correct, in terms of Poles and Ukrainians having this shared history of repression, and Poland had a lot to say with this film. And that's also why I went to Poland first and foremost. That's why I went to Agnieszka Holland, because they understood intimately the Soviet trauma. They understood what it was like to be a captive state, forced to live under Soviet occupation. Agnieszka was raised by, her parents, both her mom and dad, were journalists, and her father's official cause of death was suicide while under police interrogation. So for her, this was a deeply personal story as well. And I know what she told me, that she said that, she gets a lot of genocide scripts because she did Europa and In Darkness, two classic films in the Holocaust. So she gets all the genocides. Like, people send her genocide scripts all the, she's like the genocide filmmaker.
Hooray!
But yeah. And so she said yes to this one because she felt that that the themes were so timely, that, like a lot of what you captured in your piece of indifference and apathy and a startling lack of empathy, and just not understanding in our privileged lives in the West how people are living in other parts of the world, or even among us now, right, with the pandemic and the food insecurity crisis and mental health crisis and poverty now that's worsened under this crisis. So I think first and foremost for her, it's a call for greater empathy and awareness, and she really wanted to make the film for those same reasons, to basically shake people up and make them confront all of these horrific components, from conformity in the media, corruption in the media and governments, and how Western governments profit from blood money. Look at our relationship with China, everybody making money off of China while China's building concentration camps. So yeah, I think what's been really amazing is how so many people see like all these modern parallels to today with Mr. Jones.
Yeah, I mean, that the parallels, I wasn't quite sure if that was the direct thing you were trying to do, or if that was just an incidental thing that just kind of came out of the production. So I didn't know, was it intentional, or was that just kind of things that people have been just glomming onto as they're watching it and realizing, like, oh, we're aligning ourselves with the Chinese government, who are putting the Uyghurs in camps, or whatever, any other connection you want to make to it, because there's a lot of reads you can make onto it.
Yeah, I think the history itself. So the reason why authoritarian experts were warning us about this moment in time, and even drawing comparisons with Putin and Hitler, and warning that so just to sum up, like, there's a really brilliant piece that everyone should read that summarizes the whole history that inspired Mr. Jones, and it's by the Pulitzer Prize winning historian Anne Applebaum. And one thing she points out, and this piece is in the Atlantic. People can find it in the Atlantic, and the title of it is "How Stalin Hid Ukraine's Famine from the World." And one thing she points out in this piece is that rabid propaganda, widespread propaganda, is what produced the genocide. So the reason why Mr. Jones has this universal, what feels like a universal application today, you can see so many modern parallels, is because at the heart of the story is propaganda as a weapon, and at the heart of the story is the urgent information, is the urgent reminder that propaganda kills. Propaganda, disinformation. It's not something we can just casually overlook and dismiss and think that it's limited to crazies falling for this stuff and that's it. It is a weapon. It is extremely dangerous, and it leaves targeted groups extremely vulnerable. And so while working on the screenplay, we also had an uptick in state-sponsored propaganda, from sweeping Kremlin bots that were pushing major elections, and to all this rise in disinformation, pumping out stuff against the helping produce the anti-vaxxer movement and QAnon and so forth. So we're living in an age of propaganda and confusion, and so it just was a natural development in the script and the film, that it wasn't like something so intentional. As I was working on the script and the film, I couldn't believe lines that I was writing and scenes I was writing that were inspired by history, and how chilling the parallels were. Like, for me, it was mind-blowing and surreal. I couldn't get over. It took me a very long time to process the fact that this was about today in so many ways. Like, it was never supposed to be about today. It was supposed to be a project to honor my grandfather. Sorry about that. So it was supposed to be a project to honor my grandfather and to honor the millions lost in this genocide. It was never supposed to be a comment on what's going on today. It was really just to pay tribute to an overlooked, little-known genocide.
Like, moment of depressing serendipity, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you? I noted
Sorry.
in my review that I think that it's been fascinating that there's been an uptick in Soviet movies lately that have been just there feels like there's kind of this widespread cultural re-examination of the 20th century happening in both like Eastern European cinema and a little bit in Hollywood with like Chernobyl, Death of Stalin. I wrote a list in the essay. Did you find it fascinating that your movie coincided with all that?
Yeah, I mean, I loved those projects. I know Death of Stalin was based on a French graphic novel, and Mr. Jones did extraordinarily well in France. and and Chernobyl, of course, was years in the making, and that was so brilliantly done and necessary and needed because Chernobyl um, played a key role in Ukraine's push for independence. They're tired of being a abused colony under Moscow, and Chernobyl was one of the last straws that really helped push Ukraine to fight for its independence from Moscow. And so I think all these films that you mentioned that they really gained their momentum in recent years. I think because that's just a part of history that we don't hear enough about. If you think about the decades that the Soviet Empire existed and all the captive nations that were stuck under Soviet oppression and the Iron Curtain, each of those countries had their resistance figures throughout their own history under oppression. And you can make so many films um, to fully tell this horrific period of Soviet oppression. And so, even though it seems like there's a lot of films that are coming out now, there's a ton more that need to be made. And if I had my way, if anybody wants to give me a pile of cash, I could produce a lot of different screenplays on the entire Soviet period from many different perspectives. I can give you an example of my next screenplay that I'm developing with a director who was our first. It was Agnieszka Holland's longtime protege. She was our first unit director, Olga Heifetz. She's a brilliant, brilliant up and coming Polish director. She and I are directing a script inspired by my father-in-law, who's on Wikipedia for leading a student movement, a student uprising in 1956 in 1956 Romania in solidarity with the Hungarian uprising next door. And that is a story that grabbed my heart because it's not only my father-in-law's story, and I loved him very much, and he passed away, but I want to cherish him in his memory. It's not just because of that, it's because it's this chilling reminder of all these extraordinary lives that were lived trapped behind the Iron Curtain, trapped under Soviet oppression, and how people coped with that, and how they resisted, and how they fought back, and the price they paid for that. So while it may seem like there's a lot of Soviet films coming out, there's just simply, in my view, not enough. And I would love to dedicate the rest of my life and helping produce more of these kinds of films.
So speaking to the Mr. Jones itself, one of the more interesting things I thought in the film was the way it portrayed George Orwell. That's one of those things, those elements that kind of handled improperly could probably be the most cliche thing about a movie. If you know what I mean? Like, oh, we're bringing in the most famous historical figure involved, and and the character shows up and he says all of the quotable things that you expect someone like that to say, but really that's not the case. I think the movie does a good job kind of portraying him in his raw, naive young state before he kind of went into that period of introspection and was able to write his great anti-authoritarian books. Like, and I thought that the movie itself kind of suggests that his de-radicalization was kind of the great success of Gareth Jones's career, because where Jones himself was not able to convince the world that the Holodomor was happening, he was able to inspire other people to take his mission through life and thus inspire others. Was that the goal of that story specifically, just to kind of see the possibility that Jones was able to do more than he was able to do on his own?
Yeah, I think for me, it was a resurrection story. Because Gareth's story alone was tragic. Because Durante ultimately wins, right? Like Gareth is killed the day before his 30th birthday and forgotten. And Durante and the liars go on and enjoy their glory, and the Soviets get away for decades with covering up this famine and muddling the truth. And so for me, it was just sort of like it takes a chain of people to get the truth out, and that's what I've seen in resistance to online organizing in the face of authoritarianism and digital organizing and fact checking. It just takes a chain of people to get the truth out. So where Gareth leaves off, Orwell picks up, and in terms of direct influence, what we do know for a fact is that George Orwell wrote a powerful review of a book by a well-known journalist at the time named Eugene Lyons, who figures in the film. So Lyons is the guy with the flask that Gareth is interviewing at Durante's party, and Lyons tells Gareth, go pick up a copy of Edgar Allan Poe's Mask of the Red Death before they ban it. So that's Eugene Lyons. He was a real-life historical character. He was from New York City. He was a card-carrying Marxist. He was really excited about the Soviet Union. He goes over to Moscow. His hopes and dreams are shattered by the reality on the ground. And in his tell-all book that he writes after leaving Moscow, it's called Assignment in Utopia. And an entire chapter of that book is dedicated to what the Western press, leading reporters like him in Moscow, did against Gareth Jones. How they banded together to say that he was lying about the famine, and they went to their respectable newspapers and effectively covered it up. And they did this in working in coordination with the Soviet government. They did this directly with Soviet pressure. There was a whole scene in which we filmed this. We filmed this scene, but it didn't make it in the final cut. But this scene came from Eugene Lyons's book. There's a scene where they're in a hotel room, all these famous journalists of Moscow, Western reporters, and the chief Soviet censor is there, and they're brokering a deal. And they're saying, and the Soviets are saying, hey, if you guys want access to this trial of the Metro Vickers British engineers that we've just arrested and are essentially holding hostage to as we know, as Gareth Jones himself pointed out, and people really have to watch the film to understand this interview you and I are having. But so the Soviets basically said, if you guys want access to this really hot news story that we've just created, you better all say that Gareth Jones is lying. And that's what they did. They full on did that. And Eugene Lyons describes it in chilling detail in a chapter in his book, Assignment in Utopia. George Orwell goes on to read the book and write a review of Assignment in Utopia. And that review sounds like it could be about Putin's Russia today. The parallels are really disturbing. And so we know from Orwell reading this book that he would have known perfectly well who Gareth Jones was and what was done to him. And Orwell himself was facing that kind of pressure and that from his views, because he came out with his brilliant book on Spain. He and his wife barely survived fighting in the Spanish Civil War with their lives. The resistance they thought they were fighting for, they went to Spain to kill fascists, to fight fascists. They had their eyes open to the true horror of Stalinism, because Stalin infiltrated the Spanish Civil War and were arresting and killing people. Like, they're carrying out Stalin's purges in the Spanish Civil War, and this was shocking, and most people didn't realize it at the time. But Orwell experienced it firsthand. He was a direct witness. And so Orwell himself knew the long arm of Stalin, how dangerous it was, and how vicious the propaganda was, and how so many brilliant people in the West were falling for it. So for him to read about what was done to Gareth Jones, that would have hit really hard for him personally, because he had that same experience in Spain. He and his wife barely escaped Spain with their lives. So another historical connection is Gareth Jones and George Orwell both had the same literary agent, and Leonard Moore, and they were both around the same age. And when we meet George Orwell in the film, he has just published his first book as George Orwell, and that's Down and Out in Paris and London. which being a book about the downtrodden and the horrible systemic crimes of poverty, like how horrific poverty is and how inhumane, that's a subject that would have appealed to someone like Gareth Jones, who cared about the welfare of everyday people. So in terms of their mindset and how they saw the world and their common sense and their independent spirit and their humanitarian hearts, they would have very much been aligned in terms of their mission as writers, as witnesses of the world. And so I think that's why he was woven into this film to show that the truth can't be killed.
Do we know if they ever met in person?
We don't. There's some video that was unearthed of amazing footage of black and white footage of a man that looks so much like Gareth Jones, like the big funny ears and all, standing outside of a bookstore that Orwell used to work at in London. But that could just be coincidence. So we don't know if they met. Obviously, Leonard Moore. One thing people have to understand about literary agents, like Leonard Moore, who represented both George Orwell and Gareth Jones, literary agents are social creatures, and they like to collect interesting writers, and they like to introduce the writers to each other. So through the literary agents I've had in my career, I've always met other writers, or I've gotten an agent through other writers. It's like that's the job of a literary agent, is to be social and to connect people and to collect an arsenal of talent that's very much, part of that you're excited about. So that's sort of why we had that scene in the film, to show them coming together as in this really key moment. And you hit the nail on the head where you said that, we meet George Orwell in the film when he's not fully Orwell yet, because I think that's so important for people to understand, because we have the hindsight of history where we can look back and note, okay, 1933, Stalin starved millions deliberately, and he was such a monster. No, in 1933, that was still people were hoping that Stalin had everything figured out, and that people were still suffering from savior syndrome and thinking, the West has collapsed because of the Great Depression. Capitalism has destroyed everything. People are starving, and we need the Soviet Union to succeed for the good of mankind. That was very much the spirit of 1933, which is why Stalin was able to get away with what he did. And so it's important for us to understand that in 1933, somebody like George Orwell, who's surrounded by Soviet sympathizers, coming out with a book like Down and Out in Paris and London, where it's all about excessive capitalism, hyper-capitalism, and how poor people and workers are abused by the system. Certainly in that moment, he's going to want something like the Soviet Union to succeed. He's going to want utopia. He's going to want a worker's paradise. And so we had that scene to illustrate that was the spirit of the times. We weren't saying that Orwell himself was complicit. He was just somebody that had a big open heart and just wanted to see some justice and an alternative way in the world, a path forward for humanity during these really dark times. And Orwell himself tells us that it was the events in Spain that opened up his eyes to the true terror and the Soviet mythology and how dangerous it was to social democracy. And so and if you want to understand fully why George Orwell is in Mr. Jones, read his powerful letter that he wrote to Ukrainian refugees stranded in refugee camps after World War II. These young hipster Ukrainian refugees managed to get a hold of a copy of Animal Farm when it just came out. They hunted down Orwell's home address in London, and that's an extraordinary story of itself, like how that happened. And they wrote a letter to Orwell in London in flowery, broken English saying, "Who are you, and how did you know the truth?" And they say, everybody in the West, like Stalin's a great hero. He saved the war. So who are you? How did you know what's really been going on? And Orwell wrote them a letter explaining all who he was, his biography, how he only got into Eton, the snobbiest of all the public schools in British society because of his scholarship. And but he was really somebody that wanted to know about the working class, and he tells all of it about how he came to his views, and he tells them how the Stalinist horrors that he witnessed and nearly escaped in Spain opened his eyes to the Soviet myth and how damaging it was to building a freer and fairer society.
Sure. Speaking of viewing the film, if you haven't seen it already, because the film did trend on our website for a couple weeks, so I get the sense a couple of our readers probably did seek it out. But I, what's the best way for people to watch it? Because I watched it initially on VOD, but there hasn't been a huge wide DVD release in the United States at the moment, so I don't know what the best way to get it in people's hands is otherwise.
So you can watch it on Amazon. It's on Amazon. Yeah, so you can watch Mr. Jones on Amazon, on iTunes. You can buy a DVD on Amazon. The 90th anniversary of Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine is taking place in 2023. And so we hope to do a bunch of theatrical screenings in honor of that. So if you can see Mr. Jones on a big screen, because the train sequences alone are really gorgeous when you're in a theater. So so those are the places to watch it.
Definitely, that'd be the kind of movie I wish I could see in a movie theater right about now. But it's a shame it had to come out now. Well, it's a shame and not that it had to come out now, because I think it probably got a lot more attention on VOD while everyone's at home looking for movies. You know what I mean? I think has it done pretty well on VOD in the United States, you think, or?
Yeah, I mean, the distributor, Samuel Goldwyn Films, they're blown away by how well it did, especially in this challenging climate. And what I thought was really interesting, as I mentioned before, Mr. Jones was the #1 box office film in France for new releases.
Wow.
So France went ahead with the theatrical release, and the French people, after being stuck inside for weeks with the shutdown, they all flocked to the cinema to see the genocide film.
That's a very French. That's a very French thing to do.
Exactly. Yeah. So I was blown away by that. I was like, what is with the French? But so this film was a box office hit in France. And I'm so proud of that. I'm really grateful and proud. So it was the best of times and the worst of times for, I guess, releasing Mr. Jones during a once in a century pandemic.
Well, you would have had to compete against Wonder Woman had it had not been a pandemic, so maybe it was a blessing in disguise.
True. So yeah, exactly. So but yeah, I'm grateful for reviews like yours that really got the film and had such interesting things to say about it. And I really engaged with your piece, and I was really excited about it. So I appreciate you having such a thoughtful discussion on your site about Mr. Jones.
Sure, I appreciate your time. This has been a wonderful chance to talk with you and kind of highlight and clarify a couple things I had questions about. So, again, thank you so much. I hope you have a good day.
Thank you. Take care, Tyler.
You too. And thank you for all the Geeks Under Grace people for reading. Definitely go check that out if you haven't seen it already.